którego za chwilę Państwo zobaczą, jest świetnym historykiem, ale tak naprawdę jest także wybitnym mówcą, jest świetnym obserwatorem świata. Jego opis tego, co wydarzyło się w 2008 roku, dla bardzo wielu stał się niemal Biblią, ale na tym rzecz jasna nie poprzestał, dlatego że bardzo trafnie opisał, jak zmienił się świat w czasie pandemii COVID-19. Do dzisiaj jego spostrzeżenia są wyjątkowo trafne, dlatego bardzo się cieszę, że to właśnie on będzie Państwu opowiadał o tym, w jakiej sytuacji, także ekonomicznej, przyjdzie nam odbudowywać Ukrainę i przyjdzie nam się w to zaangażować. Jest laureatem wielu nagród, nie bez powodu, dlatego teraz nie przedłużając, mam nadzieję, że przywitają Państwa brawami naszego gościa. Adam Tooze z Columbia University.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be here. When you see a video like the one we just did see, I saw it from the side here, to me at least, it brings over a slightly humbling feeling. Feels a little incongruous to be talking about the large, spanning concept that I'm going to be introducing to you in the next 15 minutes, this idea of polycrisis. It seems a long way away from the extraordinary impact that so many people, to use the phrase, just like us, are experiencing not very far away from where we are right now. The war, the disruption, the psychological impact, all of us we can at least stretch our imaginations to feel what those young women are going through and the way in which they're trying to stitch their lives back together again, and the organization and entrepreneurship of a firm like MasterCard in trying to respond to that crisis. It seems quite a long way from what I'm going to embark on doing in the next 15 minutes, but I think in truth, it isn't just Europeans, it is literally tens, if not hundreds of millions of people around the world right now who are going through crises of the type that video so graphically described. If you think about the population of Pakistan, 1/3 of which was inundated. If you think about the ongoing crisis, the decades of crisis in the Middle East, refugee problems around the world, the function and the effect of the war has in a sense been to bring reality back to us. And if you open the pages of a newspaper, any newspaper, you can see the newspaper by the color that I'm most closely associated with as a columnist. It's almost sort of like a daily psychodrama. Pick your story, pick your narrative line. The world is facing shocks of extraordinary range and diversity all at once, it seems, everything all at once at full speed. And I think there are different ways of responding to this. One is a kind of shrugging. It's almost, I'm tempted to label it the nihilist response, which is simply to say, well, it's always been so. This is simply what history is, a series of dynamic changes, challenges. I don't think any of us actually at this point find that terribly adequate, though we may use it as a defensive reflex, as a way of getting through. Another way of thinking about the situation that we're in is to look for one single common denominator, a single fundamental driver of everything. If you're given to stories about human nature, it might be, well, it's all fundamentally down to, I don't know, short-sightedness, or fundamentally the drivers of greed or the lust for power. Or if you have friends on the left, you'll find them knee-jerking to a position which says, well, ultimately, if we all sit down over coffee, I can explain how this relates to the crises of capitalism, which dominate all our lives in various ways. The wager of those of us who are committed to try and working out this concept of polycrisis is in fact to try and insist that the world that we're facing today and the crises that we face in it are the result neither of just the run of history as we've always known it. We're insisting that there is in fact something radical and new about our situation, nor, however, can that be reduced to the working through of a single logic, but that we actually have to tangle with the fact that we are at the intersection, caught up in a radical, novel intersection of not one, but at least 4, possibly 5 different driving crises simultaneously. One of which is indeed what Joseph Schumpeter would have called the creative destructive process of capitalist development. Another are the long-standing crises of modern politics, the fundamentally unfounded way in which modern politics operates the world over, manifesting itself in populism and conservatism, in various types of authoritarianism. A third element is the persistent problem of modern geopolitics, the clashing of nation states on a scale that we have never seen before. And I mean that seriously. If you think about world history, there has never been a state as large and as potent as modern China is today. And a rising power of that scale has never faced an antagonist as powerful as the United States is. So if we insist that this is a familiar story of rising power against incumbent, ladies and gentlemen, we shouldn't kid ourselves to imagine that we've ever encountered quite this kind of drama before. So the world is in the grip of the playing out on a huge scale. The world economy today is $170 to $180 trillion colossus. It's a scale of economic activity we've never seen before, subject to shocks of a type we've never seen at this scale before. So on the one hand, it's classic stories playing out on a huge scale, but there is a fourth dimension, and I'm even bracketing tech at this point and subsuming it within the dynamic of capitalist development. There is a fourth element, which is the environmental crisis, which in its scale, in its pace, at the level at which we're seeing it now, at the tipping points and thresholds that we're reaching, is novel in history. And the challenge that we face, and the challenge that several of us associated largely with the Financial Times, Martin Wolf, Larry Summers, and myself, are trying to, as it were, force onto the agenda of public conversation, is this radical, novel situation that policymaking faces at this point. If we bring this back to Europe, the term was in fact introduced into conversation some time ago by Jean-Claude Juncker. If I can go back to just celebrate the European Commission President for a second. He first started talking about polycrisis in the period 2014 to 2015, when he saw it subsuming the Eurozone crisis, if you remember the final stages of the Greek debt crisis, the refugee crisis, Ukraine phase 1, the populism upsurge in Britain and in Trump, and I won't even mention its local manifestation in Poland. You could see that played forward into the present day, amplifying all of those forces with China, Ukraine too, COVID on top of everything else, driving the pace of development at a level that we have not seen before. But you could also trace it backwards to 2008. Many people, including Nassim Taleb, have made reference to 2008 in talks today. But if you think about the convergence of forces that were operating at that moment, it wasn't just the financial crisis, it was the failure of the WTO round in Doha, so the first crumbling of globalization. It was the failure of the Copenhagen Climate Conference in 2009. It was the first moment of a shooting war in the post-Soviet space in Georgia. And it was, and most of us suppress this, a huge global panic of a pandemic variety around swine flu. The idea of the polycrisis argument is to insist that we have entered, not immediately, not yesterday or the day before yesterday, but over a period of 10 to 15 years, a new era of challenge. A new era in which the forces of geopolitics, economic instability, domestic political stress, and the climate crisis are converging on us in a way that we have never seen before. Now, the weird thing about making this kind of claim is how certain we are, at least in many respects, about the science. How certain we are about the great acceleration thesis, how clear it is across an extraordinary range of physical forces that we are indeed in an unprecedented era. Apart from a dedicated hardcore of climate deniers and environmental skeptics, there are very few people who would dismiss the idea that humanity as a whole collectively has been accelerating toward, since 1945, not just in the last decade, but since 1945, into an era of absolutely shocking environmental transformation, both in terms of climate change, in terms of species loss, in terms of the acidification of global oceans, desertification of the land that we rely on for our livelihoods. There is a sense, a willingness to believe extraordinarily radical claims about the world that we're in on the basis of hard science, but an extraordinary reluctance and deep conservatism about the idea that this time could be different when we talk about economics. An extraordinary reluctance on the part of many critics of the idea of polycrisis to admit the possibility that we could, as a collective group, be facing a world which is radically different from anything we've ever faced before. And if you struggle with this dichotomy between a willingness to believe extraordinary hypotheses about the physical world, and after all, climate change is a staggering idea It's so hard to actually measure. We need satellites and complex apparatuses. It is a hugely daring, vertiginous suggestion about the world, up to and including the idea that the Earth has actually shifted off its axis by 45 meters in the last 50 years. We're even willing to credit scientists when they claim that. And on the other hand, a profound skepticism when it comes to saying something like, well, we might have to fundamentally change the way in which we organize production and consumption. As the quip on the left goes, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine fundamental change in our socio and economic systems. Why might this be? Well, I think part of the problem is that environmental saying, environmental prediction has a bad reputation. It's a bad reputation that goes back for a long way. It goes back to the beginning of modern economics, to 220 years back to the time of Thomas Malthus, who was the first economist to use an environmental hypothesis to drive an economic argument. Famously, he predicted we'd run out of food. He was wrong. The Club of Rome in 1973 famously predicted that we would run out of resources. They were wrong. In other words, our problem is, in part, that we have a very solid and powerful element in physical science and a very poor track record on the economic and social side in making the sort of claim that I want to make today. But nevertheless, it seems to me incumbent on us, it's in fact a responsibility to insist and to sound the alarm in the way in which we're trying to do. But the way in which you do that, it seems to me, matters. Because the argument of the polycrisis hypothesis is not that we need to revive a pessimistic Malthusianism. The point is not that we are doomed by inexorable logics. The point is not that human innovation and change cannot make a substantial difference to our condition. In fact, the point is precisely that the triumphs of human endeavor, of innovation and productivity increase since the Industrial Revolution have totally transformed the environmental envelope in which we live. So rather than a neo-Malthusianism, this is, if you like, a post-Malthusianism. It's a theory for a world after we tackled and dealt with the Malthusian problem. But there is undeniably, at this point, evidence for the fact that we are running up in a new way against environmental limits of a type that we have so far avoided. It's clear that, furthermore, our successful effort to escape the limits of the environmental impasse of the 18th and 19th centuries are now blowing back on us in the environmental effects that we are achieving. We should, furthermore, not kid ourselves that our huge successes in technology and industrial progress since the 1800s promise that we will succeed again. We talk, for instance, about energy transition. We talk about the idea of energy transition as though we're going to do the next energy transition, as though we've ever done an energy transition. But the story of energy consumption worldwide since the Industrial Revolution is not the substitution of organic by coal, and then coal by petrol, and now petrol by nuclear and renewables. The story of energy consumption since the Industrial Revolution is agglomeration, more and more energy types added on top of each other. We have never actually achieved an energy transition of the type that we're currently contemplating. Nor should we console ourselves that our existing systems are delivering the incentives that we need. We are way behind the curve of the energy investment that's necessary to see us through to sustainability. So there's nothing in the existing conjuncture that would warrant us in believing that we have got what's necessary. If we are gambling on technology, which is most conservatives' way out of this crisis, we should think about the fact that global publicly funded energy research and development for all types of energy, I'm not talking about the focus on renewables here, is in the order of $30 billion per annum. American households spend $5 billion more per annum on pet food and treats for their dogs and cats than all of the governments combined in the world spend on energy research of any kind. Forget renewables. We're not even trying. We're not breaking a sweat in the search for a solution to the problems that we face. And technology is not going to do it. Technology is by itself not going to be the answer to our problems. And to compound this and to really finish as close as I can to time, to express why those of us who articulate this position are willing to stick our necks out and say, and I don't mean to dramatize or heroize what we're doing, it's an intellectual thesis after all, but it's one that takes us back to terrain which is blasted, which has been devastated by the critique of Malthusianism. But we need to go back there to say, we are in a crisis the likes of which we've not seen before, and we currently don't have an answer to it. Another fundamental reason why we need to express it in these dramatic terms is that the we, it's not just a question of a polity like Poland or the EU or the United States deciding how to price carbon or how to invest or how much money to spend on cat food and how much money to spend on energy research. We actually have to complete the most radical political problem that we could collectively face, which is doing it together. Because this, ladies and gentlemen, is the chart of CO2 emissions in the world right now. And the first lesson that we draw from this as Europeans is that we no longer hold, no longer holds its destiny in its own hands. Radically so. EU emissions, including Germany and Poland, the big coal-hungry states, are 7% of the global total. America's share is 12%. China's share is 27% of global emissions. So it's tempting to say, in a kind of alarmist spirit, well, ultimately, the Chinese decide the future of us and everyone else. But if you look at this chart from the point of view of Beijing, the conclusion for them is hardly any less sobering, because they can't do it themselves either. The upshot of this is that if we are going to do that, we actually have to make a we. We actually have to collectively constitute an agent to address this problem. And if you thought the technological issues were difficult, if you thought the economics of climate change were difficult, that political problem, the constitution of humanity as a political agent, is the challenge which this climate dimension poses in what ultimately I think justifies us in saying, with the emphasis that we do, and with, to extent, if you like, the Google-eyed, slightly panicky tone of voice in which we do it, that folks, we are facing a crisis the likes of which we have never faced before. Because in the notion of crisis is not just the question of problem, not just the question of challenge, and not just the cliched idea that a crisis is an opportunity. In the notion of crisis is also embedded the question of identity. Fundamentally, a crisis is a problem that you can't master that challenges your identity. And that's precisely what this challenge, mapped by this graph, does. Thank you very much for your patience. I hope you have a good conference.